Mom just signed these before dinner. My son Ethan smiled as he slid a thick folder across the kitchen island like it was nothing more than another family errand. I trusted him enough to reach for a pen without asking questions. Then, for reasons I'll never fully explain, I turned to the very last page first. The signature staring back at me already had my name on it, perfectly written, perfectly forged. My fingers went numb. My heart stopped for one terrifying second as I realized someone had signed my life away before I ever touched the paper. If this story reminds you that trust should never replace caution, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever ignored a warning because it came from someone you loved? Share your experience in the comments, and if stories like this move, you don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue this journey together. My name is Ruth Cole, and until that Sunday evening, I believed the greatest blessing of my life was my only child. Looking back now, I wonder if that's where I made my first mistake. I was 69 years old, a retired elementary school teacher living in Columbus, Ohio. For 38 years, I taught third graders how to read, solve long division, and believed they were capable of becoming anything they dreamed of. Parents often told me I had endless patience. My colleagues joked that I could calm a room full of restless children with nothing more than a smile and a story. Perhaps they were right. Unfortunately, patience doesn't always prepare you for betrayal. My husband Thomas Cole used to say that people often confuse kindness with weakness. Kindness is a choice, he'd remind me whenever someone took advantage of my generous nature. Weakness is letting them do it twice. Thomas wasn't cynical, quite the opposite. He believed deeply in people, but he also believed trust should be earned continuously, not granted forever. He handled most of our investments because numbers came naturally to him. During the week, he worked as a civil engineer, and on weekends, he enjoyed reading books about personal finance, retirement planning, and the stock market. While other couples watched football on Sunday afternoons, Thomas would spread financial newspapers across our dining room table and explain compound interest as if he were telling me an exciting adventure story. I rarely understood every detail, but I loved listening to him. "We're not building wealth for luxury," he would say. "We're building freedom." Freedom. That word meant more to him than money ever did. He wanted us to retire without depending on anyone, not our government, not our neighbors, not even our future children. Children should inherit love, he often said, not responsibility for their parents. At the time, I thought he worried too much. I couldn't imagine our son ever seeing us as a burden. Ethan had always been such a thoughtful boy. After Thomas passed away 6 years earlier, following a brief battle with pancreatic cancer, silence settled over our house like heavy winter snow. We had been married for 43 years, 43 birthdays, 43 Christmas mornings, 43 anniversaries that arrived far too quickly. When you've spent that much of your life beside someone, you don't simply lose a spouse, you lose the witness to your entire adulthood. For months after the funeral, I still found myself setting 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter each morning before realizing one would remain untouched. Sometimes I'd hear a floorboard creak upstairs and instinctively think Thomas was coming down for breakfast. Grief has a cruel way of creating tiny illusions. They only last a second, but they hurt every time. During those lonely months, Ethan became my greatest comfort. He called almost every evening. He visited every weekend. He insisted on mowing my lawn, changing my smoke detector batteries, and checking my furnace before winter arrived. Whenever I thanked him, he'd simply shrug. That's what sons are supposed to do. Hearing those words always made my heart swell with pride. I thought Thomas would have been proud too. I had poured everything I had into raising Ethan. There were years when Thomas worked overtime while I tutored students after school because we wanted Ethan to attend Ohio State University without graduating under a mountain of debt. I sold jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother. Thomas postponed buying his dream fishing boat. We skipped vacations for nearly a decade. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile. Education, we believed, was something no one could ever take away. Ethan graduated with honors in finance. When he landed a position at a respected financial advisory firm in Columbus, I cried harder than I had at his college graduation. My son helps families secure their futures. I proudly told anyone willing to listen. Neighbors, church friends, former coworkers, cashiers at the grocery store. Anyone. Parents live for moments like that. Success doesn't belong only to the child. It belongs to everyone who helped build the path. A few years later, Ethan introduced us to Lauren. She was polished, intelligent, and confident without appearing arrogant. She worked in marketing for a regional healthcare company and always seemed perfectly put together. Her hair was immaculate. Her clothes looked effortlessly elegant. She remembered birthdays, sent thoughtful thank you cards, and brought homemade desserts whenever she visited. Thomas adored her immediately. "I think our boy found someone who keeps him grounded," he whispered after meeting her. I agreed. When they married, I felt like our family had grown. Not changed, grown. After Thomas died, Lauren became even more attentive. She brought soup when I caught the flu. She organized my medicine cabinet. She offered to help sort through paperwork because, as she gently reminded me, legal documents could become overwhelming after losing a spouse. I appreciated her kindness. At least that's what I believed it was. The first small change came so quietly, I barely noticed it. One afternoon, Ethan asked if he could help organize my online banking. "You shouldn't have to remember all these passwords anymore, Mom," he said. "It'll make life easier." It sounded reasonable. Truthfully, technology had never been my strength. I handed him my laptop. He updated passwords, enabled new security settings, linked my accounts to financial management software he used professionally. When he finished, everything looked cleaner, simpler. I thanked him. A few months later, he suggested switching my investment statements from paper to electronic delivery. "It's safer," he explained. "Less chance of identity theft." Again, it sounded perfectly logical. Then he offered to review my retirement accounts every quarter. "You don't need to worry about market changes," he said. "I do this every day." It felt comforting. After all, who better to trust than your own son, a financial advisor whose career revolved around protecting other people's money? Gradually, more decisions moved into Ethan's hands. He helped renew my homeowner's insurance. He recommended a different accountant. He handled conversations with my investment representative, because in his words, they'll explain things more efficiently if I speak their language. Whenever paperwork arrived, he'd summarize it. "I've already looked it over. It's standard. Nothing unusual." I stopped reading every page myself. Not because he asked me to, because I believed I didn't need to anymore. The transition happened so naturally that I never questioned it. If someone had asked whether Ethan controlled my finances, I would have laughed. Of course not. He was simply helping his widowed mother navigate a complicated world. At least that's the story I told myself. There were moments, small, forgettable moments that now replay in my mind with painful clarity. A bank statement that never arrived. An insurance letter Ethan said he'd already handled. A document he asked me to sign while we stood in my kitchen because he was running late for another appointment. I never asked enough questions. Not because I was careless. Because trust has a way of making questions feel unnecessary. I confused familiarity with safety. Love with certainty, family with immunity. As I sat in my car after leaving Ethan and Lauren's house that Sunday evening, the thick folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, my husband's voice echoed in my memory with startling clarity. "Always read every page before signing anything, Ruth." For 6 years, I had treated those words like practical advice. Now they sounded like a warning he somehow knew I would one day need. And for the first time since Thomas died, I realized I might have trusted the wrong person. I didn't drive straight home. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot of a small community park about 10 minutes from Ethan's neighborhood. It was nearly 7 in the evening, and families were beginning to leave after enjoying the last warm hours of the weekend. Children chased one another toward the playground while parents folded lawn chairs and packed coolers into SUVs. Life around me looked so wonderfully ordinary. Mine no longer felt that way. The thick folder sat on the passenger seat like it weighed 100 pounds. I reached for it again. This time there would be no distractions, no smiling son, no perfectly set dinner table, no daughter-in-law reminding me that the roast would get cold, only me and the truth. I took a slow breath before opening the folder from the very beginning. The first page looked harmless enough. It carried the logo of a law office I didn't recognize. The title read, Comprehensive Estate Planning and Asset Protection Package. If I hadn't already seen my forged signature on the last page, I might have believed that title. But now, every word felt suspicious. The second page listed my full legal name, Ruth Elaine Cole. My date of birth, my social security number, my home address, everything was accurate. Too accurate. Whoever prepared these documents had access to information that should have been private. I kept reading. Within minutes, legal terms began appearing faster than I could comfortably process them. Grantor, trustee, durable authority, irrevocable assignment, beneficiary modification. At first glance, everything sounded professional, even responsible. But one sentence made me stop. Effective immediately upon execution. Immediately, estate planning wasn't supposed to happen immediately. Thomas and I had updated our wills several times over the years. Every attorney we'd ever worked with explained that those documents existed to prepare for the future, not to transfer ownership while someone was alive and perfectly capable of managing their own affairs. I read the paragraph again, then a third time. My stomach tightened. This wasn't planning, this was surrender. I flipped another page. A detailed inventory of my assets appeared. My home, my retirement accounts, my investment portfolio, savings, certificates of deposit, even a small lake cabin Thomas and I had purchased 22 years earlier after saving for nearly a decade. Every single asset was listed. Every one, I whispered to myself. How did they get all of this? Then I remembered. Ethan. Of course. Over the last year, I'd handed him nearly every financial record I'd ever owned. Tax returns, investment summaries, insurance policies, property documents. Not because he demanded them, because I'd trusted him. My eyes moved to another paragraph. Primary successor trustee Ethan Michael Cole. That alone wasn't alarming. Children often served as trustees, but the next sentence nearly made me lose my breath. Current trustee voluntarily resigns effective immediately upon execution. Current trustee, that was me. If I signed these papers, I would no longer control my own trust. Ethan would, immediately, not after my death. Not if I became ill. Immediately. A cold chill spread through my arms. No, I whispered. No, Ethan. I kept reading. Every page became worse. One amendment granted Ethan broad authority over investment decisions. Another gave him permission to manage real estate transactions. One document authorized changes to financial accounts without requiring additional approval from me. Then I reached something that made my heart pound. Power of attorney, durable, effective immediately. Not springing into effect if I became incapacitated. Immediately. I stared at the page for nearly a full minute. Thomas would never have agreed to this. Neither would I. At least, not knowingly. My hands began trembling. For several seconds, I simply sat there listening to my own breathing. Had Ethan truly expected me to sign all this without reading it? Or had he assumed I wouldn't understand any of it? Either possibility hurt. I turned another page. There it was. The deed transfer. Our family home. The brick colonial Thomas and I bought when Ethan was 9 years old. The house where we'd celebrated birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings. The place where my husband took his last breath. The document authorized transferring ownership into a newly created family trust. Normally that wouldn't concern me, except the controlling trustee was Ethan, not me. A small note in the margin referenced future authority to sell trust property without additional beneficiary approval. Sell. My home. Without asking me. Lauren's voice suddenly echoed inside my mind. Once she signs, we can list the house within weeks. I felt physically sick. She hadn't been exaggerating. They really intended to sell it. I closed my eyes. For one painful moment, memories flooded over me. Thomas painting the nursery before Ethan was born. Helping Ethan build a treehouse that leaned slightly to one side. Watching snow fall through the living room window every Christmas Eve. The tiny pencil marks inside the pantry door measuring Ethan's height as he grew. Those weren't just walls. That house held the history of our family, and my son wanted to turn it into a real estate transaction. A tear slid down my cheek. I wiped it away impatiently. Crying could wait. Thinking couldn't. I forced myself to continue reading. Near the back of the folder, another surprise waited. A medical authorization. I frowned. Why would estate documents include medical decisions? Then I saw it. If physicians ever questioned my financial capacity, Ethan would become primary decision maker, immediately after execution, not based on medical evaluation, based solely on my signature. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every document achieved the same objective: transfer authority, transfer control, transfer ownership, transfer independence, legally, quietly, permanently. By the time I reached the final pages again, I understood exactly why Lauren had wanted me to hurry. Anyone who actually read the documents would hesitate. Anyone. Unless they never expected me to read them. I pulled out my phone. My first instinct was to call Ethan, to demand an explanation, to ask him whether he had completely lost his mind. But another voice inside me stopped that impulse. Thomas's voice. When people think they've succeeded Ruth, they become careless. I stared at the folder. If I confronted Ethan now, he'd simply deny everything, claim I'd misunderstood, find another explanation, maybe even destroy evidence. No, I needed proof before emotion. Slowly, I opened my phone's camera. One page at a time, I photographed every document, every signature line, every amendment, every handwritten note, every page number. The process took nearly 20 minutes. Before leaving, I checked each image carefully to make sure every word was readable. If anything happened to this folder, I wanted copies. As I slipped the papers back inside, something caught my attention. A business card had fallen from between two pages. It belonged to an attorney. I didn't recognize the name, but one detail immediately stood out. The office was located nearly 200 miles away. Not in Columbus, not even nearby. Why would Ethan hire an attorney from another city? Why not use our longtime family lawyer? Unless he didn't want David Mitchell asking questions. That realization sent another wave of dread through me. This wasn't something Ethan had thrown together over a weekend. It had been planned carefully, methodically, long before that family dinner. I started my car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. I wasn't driving home anymore. Tomorrow morning, I was taking these papers to the one man Thomas had trusted for over 30 years, David Mitchell. And for the first time since seeing my forged signature, I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was looking for the truth, even if it destroyed what remained of my family. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the last page of those documents. Not the legal language, not the property descriptions, just my signature, perfectly formed, confident, identical to the one I had spent decades writing on birthday cards, tax returns, school reports, and Christmas checks. Except it wasn't mine. Someone had copied it so well that even I had hesitated for a split second before realizing the truth. That frightened me more than anything else. If I could almost believe it, who else would? By 6:30 Monday morning, I was already dressed. I placed the folder inside a canvas tote bag, checked twice to make sure my phone contained every photograph I'd taken, and drove downtown to the law office of David Mitchell. David had been our attorney for over 3 decades. He had prepared Thomas's will. He had handled the purchase of our lake cabin. He had guided us through refinancing our mortgage years earlier. More importantly, he had become a genuine friend. After Thomas died, David refused to charge me for updating my estate plan. He called it one last favor for an old fishing buddy. If there was anyone I trusted to tell me the truth, even when it hurt, it was David. His receptionist smiled when I walked into the office. "Mrs. Cole, Mr. Mitchell asked that you go straight in when you arrived." That surprised me. I'd only left a brief voicemail the night before saying the matter was urgent. David must have recognized the worry in my voice. His office looked exactly as I remembered. Dark cherry bookshelves, framed law degrees, a faded photograph of him and Thomas holding enormous bass they'd caught sometime in the late 90s. For one brief moment, seeing that picture nearly made me cry. David stood as soon as I entered. "Ruth." His smile disappeared almost immediately. "You look exhausted." "I feel worse." He motioned toward the chair opposite his desk. "Start from the beginning." I handed him the folder without speaking. He opened it. The room fell silent except for the soft rustling of paper. For nearly 15 minutes, David said almost nothing. He read every page slowly. Occasionally, he underlined a sentence with his finger. Twice, he removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and put them back on. The deeper he read, the more serious his expression became. Finally, he closed the folder. "Did you sign any of this?" "No." "Are you absolutely certain?" "I've never seen those papers before yesterday." He nodded once. "I believe you." I felt a small wave of relief. Then his expression darkened again. "But we have a much larger problem." My stomach tightened. "How bad?" He turned the folder around so it faced me. "These documents weren't designed to help you." I figured that much. "No." His voice became unusually firm. "I don't think you understand." He tapped the first page. "This isn't poor estate planning." Another tap. "It isn't overly aggressive tax planning." A third tap. "This package was built to transfer practical control of your financial life without making it obvious to you." The room suddenly felt colder. David pulled out a yellow legal pad. "Let me explain this in plain English." He began writing. "Document 1. He circled the number. "Changes your trust." Another line. Document 2. "Gives Ethan broad authority over trust assets." Another. Document 3. "Allows financial management." Another. Document 4. "Positions him to control real estate." Another. Document 5. "Expands medical authority in ways I find extremely troubling." He looked directly at me. "Individually, some of these documents might appear reasonable." He spread them across the desk. "But together," he paused, "they create a roadmap." "A roadmap to what?" David answered quietly. "Taking everything." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I stared at the papers. It suddenly occurred to me that Ethan hadn't chosen random documents. Everything had been assembled with remarkable precision. Each piece supported another. Each authority reinforced the next. Whoever prepared this understood exactly what they were doing. David broke the silence. "Tell me about yesterday." I described everything, the dinner invitation, Lauren setting the table, Ethan sliding the folder toward me, the forged signature, the pressure to hurry, my excuse about forgetting my reading glasses, taking photographs, then I hesitated. "What?" I overheard something. David leaned forward. "What exactly?" I repeated Lauren's words as accurately as I could remember. "Once she signs, we can list the house within weeks." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he wrote the sentence down, word for word. Then he asked, "Did Ethan say anything?" He said he thought I'd almost noticed something. "And Lauren, she told him not to worry," I swallowed. She said I could still hear her voice. "She trusts you too much." David slowly placed his pen on the desk. "That statement concerns me even more than the documents." "Why?" "Because it suggests intent." He folded his hands. "Fraud cases are rarely about one document. They're about patterns, planning, manipulation, preparation. What you overheard suggests this wasn't spontaneous." I looked toward the window. People walked calmly along the sidewalk outside. They had no idea that inside this office, my understanding of my own family was falling apart. I keep asking myself one question. David waited. "When did my son become this person?" He sighed. "I've practiced law for 42 years. I've seen siblings sue each other. Children steal from parents. Parents disinherit children. Money changes people in ways that still surprise me. But one thing remains consistent." He leaned back. "Cases like this almost never begin with one big decision. They begin with small compromises. I immediately thought about online banking, passwords, electronic statements, tax documents, insurance, one favor at a time, one tiny step after another, until I no longer noticed control changing hands. I let it happen. David shook his head firmly. You trusted your son. Those are not the same thing. His words eased a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying. I need you to answer another question. Anything. Has Ethan had access to your signature before? I almost laughed. Thousands of times. Birthday cards, holiday checks, insurance forms, school paperwork I'd saved, old family files, everything. David nodded slowly. That makes forgery much easier. A terrible thought crossed my mind. Can they actually prove I signed these? That's exactly what we'll determine. He stood and walked toward a filing cabinet. After retrieving another folder, he placed several documents beside mine. My original estate planning file. Inside were documents Thomas and I had signed years earlier. David compared signatures. One, then another, then another. He frowned. What? The signature on these new documents is impressive. My heart sank. Impressive? It imitates your writing remarkably well. He looked up. But imitation isn't authenticity. He pointed toward small details I'd never noticed. The pressure changes. The ending stroke differs. The letter C in Cole closes differently. You've unconsciously written your name the same way for decades. He smiled slightly. Forgers usually copy appearance. They rarely copy habit. For the first time that morning, hope appeared. So someone can prove it's fake. I know someone who can. He picked up his phone. I'll contact a forensic document examiner. Before dialing, he looked back at me. Ruth, yes, until we understand exactly how far this goes. He spoke slowly. Do not tell Ethan you've seen me. Do not accuse him. Do not sign anything. What if he asks? You smile. You thank him. You tell him you've been busy. And most importantly, he paused. You let him believe you still trust him. I stared at him. You want me to pretend? I want him comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. As difficult as that sounded, I knew he was right. Just as I stood to leave, David spoke one final sentence that stopped me cold. Ruth. I turned around. If someone was willing to forge your signature... He looked down at the stack of papers. There's a very real possibility these aren't the first documents they forged. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because suddenly, every piece of mail that had gone missing, every financial statement Ethan had already handled, every form I'd signed without reading, every password he'd changed, none of it felt innocent anymore, and for the first time I wondered if the dinner had never been the beginning of the scheme, only the final step. David's final words followed me all the way home. There's a very real possibility these aren't the first documents they forged. Until that moment, I had been thinking about one folder, one forged signature, one terrible dinner. Now I couldn't stop wondering whether I had been living inside a carefully constructed illusion for months or even years. I unlocked the front door of my house, stepped inside, and stood silently in the foyer. Everything looked exactly the same. Thomas's favorite grandfather clock still ticked steadily against the wall. The framed family photograph from Ethan's college graduation still hung above the staircase. The scent of lavender from the diffuser I kept in the living room lingered in the air. Nothing around me had changed, yet I no longer trusted the story those familiar surroundings had always told me. I carried the folder into Thomas's old study. Although he had been gone for 6 years, I had never found the heart to remodel the room. His oak desk still faced the window overlooking our backyard. His leather chair still squeaked when someone sat in it. Books about engineering investing and American history still lined the shelves exactly as he had left them. Whenever life became overwhelming, I came here. Somehow, sitting where Thomas had spent countless evenings balancing our finances always helped me think more clearly. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside were neatly labeled file boxes. Thomas had been extraordinarily organized. Every tax return, every mortgage statement, every insurance renewal, every investment report, every property record. Each year had its own folder. As I began pulling files onto the desk, I realized something unsettling. Several folders felt thinner than I remembered. I frowned. Maybe I was imagining it. I opened the file labeled 2024 Financial Records. The table of contents Thomas had typed years ago listed 12 monthly brokerage statements. Only 8 remained. I counted twice. Still 8. 4 statements were gone. I opened another folder. The homeowner's insurance file. It contained renewal letters, premium notices, claim information, but the signed renewal agreement from last year was missing. My pulse quickened. I moved to the tax records. Every return was there, but several supporting documents had disappeared. I sat back in the chair. This can't be happening. I whispered the words into the empty room. I had always believed my filing system was complete. Thomas and I had built it together. Neither of us ever threw away financial records. Never. So where had those papers gone? A memory surfaced. About a year earlier, Ethan had spent an entire Saturday helping me organize old paperwork. We'd sorted boxes in the basement. He insisted many documents no longer needed paper copies because everything was available electronically. I remembered thanking him. I remembered buying pizza for lunch. I remembered feeling grateful that my son was willing to spend an entire weekend helping his widowed mother. Now I wondered whether he had been helping me at all, or helping himself. The realization made me physically ill. I reached for another box. This one contained old bank correspondence. Near the bottom lay an envelope from my bank that I'd almost forgotten. The letter informed me that paper statements would stop unless I requested otherwise. I remembered that conversation. Ethan said electronic delivery is much safer. I had signed the authorization without a second thought. At the time, it had sounded practical. Now another question formed. If statements were no longer arriving at my house, who was reviewing them first? I walked upstairs and opened my laptop. Logging into my online banking suddenly proved more difficult than expected. My usual password didn't work. Neither did the second one I remembered, nor the third. Finally, after several failed attempts, the website locked my account temporarily. I stared at the screen. That wasn't right. I hadn't changed my password, unless Ethan had. Again. I called the bank's customer service line. After verifying my identity, the representative reset my login credentials. When I finally accessed my account, nothing immediately appeared unusual. The balances looked familiar. The savings account remained healthy. My pension deposits continued arriving monthly, but something else caught my attention. Several notification settings had been changed, paper statements disabled, email notifications redirected, security alerts turned off, recovery phone number, I froze. The listed phone number wasn't mine. It belonged to Ethan. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. I felt neither anger nor panic, only disbelief. How long had that been there? The representative hadn't questioned it because someone with authorized access had made the changes months earlier. Months, not days, months. I immediately replaced the number with my own and changed every password. Then I remembered David's advice. Don't make obvious changes. Don't alert Ethan. I hesitated. Had I just made a mistake? Would Ethan receive notification that account settings had changed? My stomach tightened. There was no way to know. I picked up the phone and called David. He answered almost immediately. Ruth, I think I may have done something foolish. What happened? I explained everything. The missing files, the online banking, the recovery phone number, changing the password. He listened carefully. When I finished, he was silent for several seconds. I don't think you've jeopardized the investigation. I exhaled. But you've confirmed something important. What? Control over your accounts extended further than we realized. I sat down slowly. So he really was monitoring everything. It certainly appears that way. David asked me to write down every unusual financial event I could remember over the past 2 years. No detail is too small. At first I struggled. Then memories began arriving one after another. The time Ethan insisted on accompanying me to the bank because older customers are often targeted by scammers. The investment review meeting where he answered nearly every question before I had the chance. The afternoon he told me my accountant had retired and recommended someone else. The insurance forms he claimed only required routine signatures. The unexpected replacement of one certificate of deposit. The afternoon he borrowed my house key because Lauren wanted to measure the guest bedroom for new curtains. Each memory had seemed harmless. Each explanation had sounded reasonable. Each event had been isolated. Now they connected like pieces of the same puzzle, a puzzle I had never realized I was assembling. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Emily Parker stood on my front porch carrying a paper bag from my favorite bakery. Emily and I had taught together for nearly 25 years. She was one of the few people who still called instead of texting. She took one look at my face and frowned. "You've been crying." "I'm fine." She crossed her arms. "Ruth, we spent 24 years spotting third graders who lied about finishing homework. You were never any better at hiding the truth than they were." Despite everything, I laughed. Only Emily could make me smile on a day like this. I invited her inside. We sat in the kitchen with coffee and cinnamon rolls neither of us touched. For several minutes, I debated how much to tell her. Finally, I took a deep breath. "I think Ethan is trying to steal everything Thomas and I spent our lives building." The words sounded impossible, even after saying them aloud. Emily didn't interrupt. She simply listened while I explained everything. The dinner, the documents, David, the investigation. When I finished, tears filled my eyes. I keep asking myself what I did wrong. Emily reached across the table and gently took my hand. "You loved your son. I trusted him. Those aren't crimes." "I should have seen it." She shook her head. "No. Good people usually don't expect deception from the people they love most." I looked down. "I feel foolish." Emily smiled sadly. "You know what I remember most about your classroom?" I frowned. "What?" "You believed every child deserved another chance." I nodded. "I still believe that." "So do I." She squeezed my hand. "But giving someone another chance is different from giving them unchecked control." Her words lingered in my mind. Love and accountability weren't opposites. Neither were trust and verification. Thomas had understood that. David understood it. Emily understood it. Somehow, I never had. As Emily prepared to leave, she stopped at the front door. "Promise me something." "What?" "No matter what happens." She looked directly into my eyes. "Don't let Ethan convince you that asking questions makes you a bad mother." After she drove away, I stood alone on my porch for a long time. The evening sun cast long shadows across the yard Thomas had loved. For the first time since this nightmare began, I understood something clearly. This wasn't simply about money. It wasn't even about my house. It was about something far more valuable. Someone had slowly taught me to confuse obedience with love, and now I was finally learning the difference. By Wednesday morning, my dining room table no longer looked like the place where Thomas and I had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for nearly 4 decades. Instead, it had become an investigation headquarters. Stacks of bank statements covered one end of the table. Property records sat in carefully labeled folders. Printed copies of my online banking activity were arranged by date. My handwritten notes filled an entire yellow legal pad. For the first time in my life, I wasn't organizing lesson plans. I was organizing evidence against my own son. Every time that thought crossed my mind, my chest tightened. There had been moments over the past few days when I almost convinced myself David was wrong. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. Maybe Ethan had made poor decisions but never intended to hurt me. Then I would look at the forged signature again. That illusion disappeared immediately. Around 9 o'clock, David called. "Michael is ready." Michael Reynolds, the forensic accountant. David had spoken highly of him. He used to investigate corporate embezzlement for the FBI before opening his own practice, David had explained. "If anyone can reconstruct what's happened to your finances, it's Michael." An hour later, I found myself sitting inside Michael's office. Unlike David's traditional law office, Michael's workspace looked modern and almost clinical. 3 large computer monitors occupied his desk. Financial charts covered one wall. Whiteboards displayed timelines and handwritten notes from other investigations. Michael himself was soft-spoken. He looked to be in his early 60s, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades following numbers instead of emotions. He shook my hand. "Mrs. Cole." "Please," I said quietly. "Call me Ruth." He smiled warmly. "David has filled me in on the basics." He paused. "But I'd rather hear the story from you." For nearly 40 minutes I repeated everything once again. The dinner, the folder, the forged signature, the overheard conversation, the missing financial records, the changed online banking settings. Michael never interrupted. Instead, he made careful notes. Occasionally, he asked specific questions. "When did Ethan first begin helping with your finances? Did anyone besides Ethan ever have access to your banking passwords? Who recommended changing your statements to electronic delivery? Were you ever asked to sign blank forms?" Each question forced me to think more carefully. Some answers came immediately. Others required digging through memories I hadn't revisited in years. When I finished, Michael folded his hands. "Ruth, there are 2 types of financial fraud." I waited. "The first happens quickly. A criminal steals money and disappears." He held up a second finger. "The second develops slowly. The victim never realizes control is being transferred until almost everything has already changed." I swallowed. "Which one is this?" "I don't know yet." His honesty surprised me. "But I can tell you something important." "What?" "If someone planned this carefully." He tapped the stack of documents. "They almost certainly left a trail." That single sentence gave me hope. Numbers don't lie, people do. Michael turned one monitor toward me. "I've already started reviewing the account summaries David sent yesterday." Color-coded spreadsheets filled the screen. Rows of deposits, transfers, withdrawals, investment activity. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then Michael highlighted several transactions. "Do you recognize these?" I leaned closer. 3 transfers, each for just under $10,000. Spread several months apart. The descriptions looked ordinary. Investment adjustment, account restructuring, portfolio allocation. "I don't remember these." "I didn't expect you would." He clicked another screen. Each transfer had eventually flowed into another account, then another, then another. It resembles layering. What does that mean? It's a technique. He chose his words carefully. Money moves through several legitimate-looking transactions before reaching its final destination. My stomach tightened. "Are you saying Ethan stole money?" "I'm saying these transactions deserve explanation." He refused to make accusations. I appreciated that. Unlike television detectives who jump to conclusions, Michael seemed determined to let facts speak first. He opened another file. "Something else concerns me." On the screen appeared my investment account. Over the past 18 months, several conservative investments had quietly been liquidated. The proceeds hadn't disappeared. They'd simply been redirected into higher-risk accounts. I frowned. I never approved that. Michael looked at me. "Are you certain?" "I've never invested aggressively." Thomas hated unnecessary risk. So did I. Michael nodded. "That's helpful." He made another note. The investigation continued for nearly 3 hours. Every answer generated 2 new questions. Every financial record revealed another small inconsistency. Individually, nothing seemed catastrophic. Together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. By early afternoon, David joined us. Michael summarized his preliminary findings. No evidence yet of large-scale theft. I felt myself relax. Then he continued. "But extensive repositioning of authority." David nodded. "Exactly what I expected." Michael pointed toward the screen. "Passwords changed. Notification settings modified. Recovery contact replaced. Investment strategy altered. Document access centralized." He looked directly at me. "None of those actions necessarily constitute fraud, but collectively," he let the sentence hang, "they demonstrate progressive control." David crossed his arms. which means someone wanted to become indispensable. Michael agreed. If Ruth stopped understanding her own finances, she'd naturally depend on the person managing them. I stared at the spreadsheet. That described my life perfectly. Every time I had a financial question, I called Ethan. Every statement I didn't understand, I asked Ethan. Every investment concern, Ethan, insurance, taxes, property, retirement, everything, without realizing it. I had slowly stopped making financial decisions. I merely approved Ethan's. Michael suddenly enlarged another document. This caught my attention. It was a digital authorization form. The electronic signature looked like mine, at least at first glance. Michael zoomed in. Tiny details became visible. The software records metadata. I frowned. Metadata? It tells us how and when a document was signed. He pointed towards several timestamps. This authorization claims it was electronically signed from your home computer. Yes, but he clicked again. The device identification doesn't match the computer you're currently using. I looked confused. What does that mean? It means the signature originated from a different device. David leaned forward. Can you determine which one? Possibly. Michael smiled for the first time. If we obtain the original files. A surge of optimism rushed through me. Finally, something concrete. David immediately began discussing subpoenas and document preservation. Much of the legal terminology went over my head, but one phrase stood out. Preserve electronic evidence. David noticed my expression. In simple terms, I nodded. We're making sure nothing disappears. That mattered, because for the first time, I believed Ethan might panic. If he realized people were looking closely, would he destroy records, delete emails, change accounts? Michael seemed to read my thoughts. People who believe they're safe rarely cover their tracks. He paused. People who suddenly realize they're under investigation often make mistakes. The meeting ended shortly before 5. As I gathered my purse, Michael handed me a small notebook. I'd like you to keep this with you. What for? Write down every interaction with Ethan. Phone calls, text messages, unexpected visits, anything unusual, no matter how insignificant it seems. I slipped the notebook into my bag. I can do that. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that terrible dinner. Not relief, not happiness. Determination. For days, I had felt like a frightened widow trying to understand impossible documents. Now, I had professionals helping me uncover the truth. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled me. When I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed. A text message from Ethan. Hey, Mom, hope you're feeling better. Lauren and I were wondering if you'd like to come over Sunday. We can finish the paperwork before lunch this time. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I slowly opened the notebook Michael had given me. On the very first page, I wrote Wednesday. 6:12 p.m., Ethan asked me to finish signing the documents. He believes I still know nothing. I closed the notebook. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only one pretending anymore. And Ethan had no idea the game had changed. I didn't answer Ethan's text right away. David had warned me not to react emotionally. Silence makes people uncomfortable, he'd said. When someone is trying to manipulate another person, uncertainty often pushes them into revealing more than they intended. So I waited. An hour, then 2. By 9 that evening, another message appeared. Everything okay, Mom? 10 minutes later, another. Just making sure you got my text. I looked at the screen without replying. The concern in his messages might have sounded genuine to anyone else. To me, after everything I'd discovered, every word carried another meaning. He wasn't wondering whether I was feeling well. He was wondering whether I had read the documents, whether I had noticed anything, whether his plan was still alive. The next morning, David called. Karen can meet today. Karen Brooks, the senior fraud investigator from my bank. David had mentioned her briefly during our previous meeting, but this would be my first time speaking with her. We met in a private conference room at one of the bank's regional offices downtown. Karen looked to be in her late 50s, with short silver hair and kind eyes that immediately reminded me of experienced school principals I'd worked with over the years. She greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Cole." "Please call me Ruth," she smiled. "I've heard wonderful things about you from David." I doubted that. There wasn't much wonderful about becoming the victim of your own son. Once everyone was seated, Karen placed a thin folder on the table. "I need to begin with something important." I nodded. "Our bank has strict privacy laws. We can't interfere in family financial decisions simply because something appears unusual." "I understand. But," she opened the folder, "there were several occasions over the last year when activity on your accounts caught our attention." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "What kind of activity?" Karen slid several printed reports toward me. "The first involved changes to your online security settings." I recognized the dates immediately. Approximately 14 months earlier. "Ethan helped me with online banking around then." Karen nodded. "That explains the timing." She continued. "Normally, changing recovery phone numbers, notification settings, and electronic delivery preferences simultaneously isn't unusual. But," she pointed to another report, "those changes were followed by several requests to modify account communication procedures." I frowned. "I don't remember requesting any of those." "I didn't expect you would." Karen spoke carefully. "They appeared properly authorized." David leaned forward. "Why did your department notice them?" Karen looked toward him. "Because of Ruth's account history." She turned back to me. "For nearly 20 years, your financial behavior remained remarkably consistent. Conservative investments, no unusual transfers, minimal account changes. Then," she tapped another page, "everything changed." Michael, who had joined us for the meeting, studied the reports quietly. Karen continued. "The changes weren't necessarily fraudulent. They were simply out of character." I stared at the documents. "I wish someone had called me." Karen's expression softened. "I wish we legally could have." She paused. "But an adult customer has every right to authorize another person to assist with financial management, even if we privately question the decision." That made painful sense. Banks couldn't investigate every adult child helping an elderly parent. If they did, millions of perfectly healthy families would face unnecessary scrutiny. Unfortunately, families like mine could hide behind those same protections. Karen opened another folder. "This concerns me even more." Inside were copies of signature cards. My original signature, updated signatures, electronic verification records. She placed them beside the documents Ethan had given me. "Look carefully." At first they appeared identical, almost perfectly so. Then Karen pointed towards several tiny details. The angle here, the pressure pattern, the spacing between letters. I leaned closer. The differences were subtle, almost invisible. Without someone guiding me, I never would have noticed them. Michael smiled slightly. "Human beings don't write their names exactly the same every time." Karen nodded. "But they repeat unconscious habits." She looked directly at me. "Whoever copied your signature understood appearance. They didn't understand rhythm." David folded his arms. "So your fraud department noticed," Karen answered carefully. "We noticed inconsistencies. We documented them. But inconsistencies alone don't establish criminal conduct." She reached for another document. "This one does concern me." The page displayed several attempted verification calls. I frowned. "What are those?" "When customers make certain account changes, our system occasionally generates verification calls." "I don't remember receiving these." Karen looked at me sympathetically. "That's because they weren't answered from your home phone." My stomach dropped. "They were redirected." I felt my mouth go dry. "Redirected," Karen nodded, "to the recovery number listed on your account. Ethan's phone." Silence filled the room. I suddenly understood why I had never been contacted. The bank had tried. Again and again, every verification request had reached my son instead of me. Michael quietly asked, "How many times Karen checked the report?" 7. 7. 7 opportunities for someone to ask whether I truly authorized those changes. 7 opportunities that never reached me. I closed my eyes. How had I missed something so enormous? David interrupted my thoughts. Did anyone inside the bank express concern? She hesitated. Unofficially? Yes. Our internal monitoring team flagged the account twice. Why wasn't stronger action taken? Because every required verification appeared successful. She looked genuinely frustrated. The system believed it had spoken with the customer. I suddenly realized the implication. They spoke with Ethan. Karen met my eyes. We can't prove that. But the verification number belonged to him. A heavy silence settled over the room. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, Karen opened the last folder. There's one more thing. Inside lay surveillance photographs from inside the bank. I blinked. What are these? Routine security footage. She slid one picture toward me. The image showed Ethan standing at one of the customer service desks. The timestamp was from 11 months earlier. Another showed him meeting with a financial representative. Another. 5 separate visits. I frowned. I don't remember going to the bank those days. Karen nodded. You didn't. My confusion deepened. Then why was Ethan there? We're still determining that. Michael examined each image. He wasn't accompanied by Ruth. No. Were appointment notes created? Karen handed him another report. Every visit references customer account updates. I looked at David. My accounts. He nodded slowly. It appears so. But without original supporting documents, we don't yet know precisely what changes were requested. Karen looked apologetic. Some archived records have already been moved into long-term storage. Michael smiled. That's all right. We'll retrieve them. For the first time during the meeting, Karen relaxed slightly. I hoped you'd say that. As everyone gathered their papers, Karen stopped me. Ruth. Yes. I've worked fraud investigations for almost 23 years. I waited. The hardest cases aren't the largest. They're the family cases. Her voice softened. Victims often blame themselves. They feel embarrassed. They wonder how they didn't see it. I lowered my eyes. I've asked myself that every day this week. She gently touched my arm. Please don't. The people most likely to be deceived, she smiled sadly, are the people who never imagined someone they love would deceive them. Those words stayed with me long after I left the bank. Driving home, I replayed every conversation with Ethan over the last 2 years. Every reassurance, every smile, every, "Don't worry, Mom, I've got it." Had any of it been genuine? Or had every act of kindness carried another purpose? My phone buzzed. Another text from Ethan. "Mom, Lauren already bought groceries for Sunday. Hope you're still coming." This time I replied, "Of course, sweetheart, I wouldn't miss family dinner." Less than 10 seconds later, 3 little dots appeared. He was typing immediately, too quickly, almost as though he'd been waiting beside his phone. His reply came moments later. "Perfect. We'll finally get everything taken care of." I stared at those last 5 words. We'll finally get everything taken care of. A week ago, I would have heard love. Now, all I heard was urgency. And somewhere deep inside, I knew Sunday wouldn't simply be another family dinner. It would be the beginning of the end. By the time Sunday arrived, I had rehearsed every smile, every nod, every casual laugh. It felt absurd. After spending 38 years teaching children to tell the truth, I was about to spend an entire afternoon pretending that nothing had changed. David insisted it was necessary. So far, he reminded me during our phone call Saturday evening, Ethan believes he's managing the situation. The moment he realizes you know the truth, he'll become unpredictable, Michael agreed. People who believe they're still in control reveal far more than people who feel cornered. Neither of them asked whether pretending would be difficult. They already knew the answer. The hardest part wasn't acting. It was looking into my son's eyes while wondering how many lies he had already told me. Before leaving home, I checked the small recorder Michael had given me. Ohio law allowed one-party consent recordings. As long as I participated in the conversation, I could legally record it. I slipped the device into my purse. Then I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. I hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked older than 69, not because of wrinkles, because trust ages a person when it breaks. At exactly noon, I pulled into Ethan and Lauren's driveway. Everything appeared normal. Lauren opened the front door before I even reached the porch. There she is. She hugged me warmly. I was worried you might cancel. I wouldn't do that, she smiled. We've made your favorite roast. The smell drifted from the kitchen. Rosemary, garlic, fresh bread. 6 days earlier, those familiar scents would have filled me with comfort. Now they reminded me how easily ordinary moments could hide extraordinary betrayal. Ethan walked in from the living room carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. Mom. He kissed my cheek. You look better. I'm feeling much better. That wasn't entirely a lie. Fear had slowly been replaced by determination. We spent the next hour talking about harmless things, the weather, a neighbor who had recently retired, Lauren's new marketing project, a baseball game Ethan planned to attend with coworkers. If someone had secretly filmed us, they would have seen a perfectly ordinary family enjoying Sunday lunch. Only I knew every word carried invisible tension. After dessert, Ethan leaned back in his chair. So, there it was, the moment. I figured we'd finish that paperwork before you head home. He said it so casually, as though he were asking me to help clear the table. Lauren immediately stood. I'll grab the folder. She disappeared into the study and returned carrying the same navy blue folder I'd taken home the previous week. My heartbeat remained surprisingly calm. I had expected panic. Instead, everything felt strangely clear. Lauren placed the folder directly in front of me. I added little sticky notes where signatures go. I looked down. Bright yellow tabs marked nearly every page. Convenient, efficient, dangerous. Ethan smiled. I know legal paperwork is boring. I highlighted everything important. I almost admired how confidently he lied. Almost. I slowly opened the folder. This time I knew exactly what every page contained. Still, I pretended to read carefully. Several minutes passed. No one spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Everything makes sense. I looked up. Mostly. His smile stiffened. Mostly. I have a few questions. A tiny change crossed Lauren's face. Barely noticeable, but enough. What kind of questions? She asked. I pointed toward one paragraph. This trustee section. Ethan answered immediately. Oh, that's standard. I nodded thoughtfully. What exactly does it mean? His answer came too quickly. It simply allows me to help manage paperwork if something ever happens. I kept my expression neutral. Something like what? You know. He shrugged. If you become sick. If you're traveling. If you don't want to deal with administrative details. None of that matched the document. Not even close. I looked back down. What about this? I pointed toward the durable power of attorney. This says effective immediately. Ethan laughed softly. That's just legal language. It doesn't actually change anything. Lie, another one. I remembered David explaining that exact clause. It absolutely changed everything. Lauren stepped in smoothly. Lawyers always write things dramatically. We didn't either understand half of it. Interesting. Earlier, Ethan had claimed he reviewed everything carefully. Now Lauren suggested neither of them really understood the documents. Their stories no longer matched. I pretended not to notice. I see. I turned another page. And the trust? What trust? The new family trust. Ethan leaned forward. It's mainly for tax purposes. Michael had specifically warned me about vague explanations. Whenever someone truly understood financial documents, they explained specifics. Manipulators preferred generalities, tax purposes, estate planning, efficiency, protection, words that sounded intelligent while saying almost nothing. I smiled politely. I've been thinking. Both of them looked at me. I'd like David Mitchell to review everything first. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Not shouting. Just silence. Lauren recovered first. David. Our attorney, Ethan forced a small laugh. Mom, David is practically retired. These documents were prepared by specialists. I'm sure they were. So why involve another lawyer? His voice remained calm, but something beneath it had changed. Pressure. Subtle. Measured. Intentional. I folded my hands. Thomas always wanted David to review important legal papers. That wasn't entirely true. Thomas wanted us to review them ourselves, but invoking his name mattered. Ethan glanced briefly toward Lauren. It lasted less than a second. Still, I saw it. A silent conversation. Lauren smiled again. Of course, if that makes you comfortable. Too easy, far too easy. They weren't giving up. They were adjusting. Ethan leaned closer. The only concern, there are filing deadlines. I raised an eyebrow. What deadlines? Another pause. Well, he hesitated. The attorney mentioned... His sentence faded. He couldn't invent details quickly enough. I waited. Eventually, he smiled awkwardly. I'll double-check. Exactly. Because there were no deadlines. David had confirmed that. I closed the folder. I'll have David look everything over this week. Then I added deliberately, if he says everything is fine, I smiled warmly. I'll sign every page. Hope returned instantly to Ethan's face. He nodded. That's perfectly reasonable. But his relief looked forced, like someone adapting to unexpected resistance. Lauren collected the folder. No rush. We just wanted to help. Help. That word again. The rest of the afternoon felt different. Conversation continued. Coffee was served. We discussed television shows, neighborhood construction, summer travel. Yet underneath every sentence ran another conversation entirely. They wondered what I suspected. I wondered what they were hiding. When I finally stood to leave, Ethan walked me to my car. He hugged me tightly. Love you, Mom. I love you too. Those words hurt more than anything else, because despite everything, they were still true. I did love him. Love doesn't disappear simply because trust does. As I started the engine, Ethan tapped lightly on my window. I rolled it down. One more thing. Yes. If David has questions, he smiled. Tell him to call me directly. Interesting. Very interesting. I smiled back. I'll let him know. Driving away, I checked my rearview mirror. Both Ethan and Lauren remained standing in the driveway long after my car turned the corner, watching, waiting. The moment I reached the next intersection, I pulled into a quiet parking lot and stopped the recorder. Nearly 3 hours of conversation. Every explanation, every contradiction, every lie. I immediately called David. How did it go? I looked down at the recorder in my hand. They lied. About what? I took a slow breath. Almost everything. David was silent for a moment. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Did they realize, I looked back toward the road leading to Ethan's neighborhood. No. They still think I'm one signature away from giving them everything. And that was exactly where we needed them to be. The morning after my visit to Ethan's house, I met David and Michael in David's office. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't bringing them questions. I was bringing evidence. I placed the recorder on David's desk. They lied repeatedly. David nodded. Let's hear it. For nearly an hour, the three of us listened carefully. Every answer Ethan had given, every interruption from Lauren, every hesitation, every contradiction. The room remained silent except for the sound of familiar voices coming from the small speaker. Hearing my son's voice outside the context of family conversation was strangely unsettling. Without emotion clouding my judgment, patterns became obvious. When I asked specific questions, Ethan answered with vague explanations. Whenever I pressed for details, Lauren stepped in to redirect the conversation. When I mentioned David Mitchell, both of them immediately became cautious. Michael paused the recording. There. He rewound several seconds. There are filing deadlines. He played it again, then again. Finally, he looked at David. He invented that. David smiled faintly. I know. No legitimate filing deadline existed. Michael nodded. Exactly. He reached for urgency because urgency discourages careful thinking. I remembered something from my teaching years. Children who wanted classmates to make impulsive decisions often used the same tactic. Hurry! Quick! Don't think about it. Apparently adults weren't much different. David continued listening until the recording ended. Then he folded his hands. They expected you to sign. I believe so. No. His expression grew serious. They expected you not to read. That distinction mattered. If they truly believed I understood the documents, they never would have risked placing them in front of me. The deception depended on trust and speed. Michael opened his laptop. I've made progress. He projected several financial timelines onto the wall. Colored lines, connected dates, account changes, property records, and banking activity. Looking at it felt like watching someone assemble the hidden story of my life. The pattern begins 16 months ago. He pointed to the first marker. Ethan gains administrative access to online banking. Another marker. Paper statements discontinued. Another. Recovery number changed. Another. Investment reallocations. Another. Insurance updates. Another. Estate planning consultations. Finally, the forged documents. Everything connected. Nothing appeared random. David studied the timeline quietly. This wasn't opportunistic, Michael agreed. It was phased. One step prepared the next. Each small decision made the following one easier. I suddenly remembered Thomas teaching Ethan to build model airplanes when he was 12. Each piece looked insignificant alone, but together they created something capable of flying. The same principle had been used here, only instead of building trust, someone had built control. David turned toward me. Ruth, yes, I believe we're ready. For what? To let Ethan make his next move, my stomach tightened. What exactly does that mean? David smiled slightly. It means we stop chasing him. We let him come to us. I frowned. I don't understand, Michael answered. People running long-term fraud usually have schedules, deadlines, objectives. If Ethan believes you still intend to sign, he'll eventually push again. And when he does, David finished the sentence. We'll be ready. That afternoon, Karen Brooks called with another update. We recovered archived records. My heart skipped. What did you find? Several appointment notes. Can you come in tomorrow? The following morning, we met again at the bank. Karen handed David a thick file. These were stored off-site. David immediately began reading. I watched his expression change. Then he passed several pages to me. Appointment summaries, customer service notes, authorization logs. One note immediately caught my attention. Customer unable to attend. Son will facilitate documentation. Date, 11 months earlier. I looked up. I never missed an appointment. Karen nodded. Our branch manager confirmed that. Another note. Customer prefers communication through Son. I never requested that. I know. Another. Customer satisfied with changes. I had never even been there. Michael quietly photographed every page. This helps. Karen hesitated. There's something else. She opened another envelope. Inside were printed visitor logs. Every customer entering certain secured areas of the bank signed electronically. Ethan's name appeared multiple times. Mine, only once, nearly 18 months earlier, before all the account changes began. I felt my chest tighten. So he came here alone. Karen nodded. Repeatedly. David asked carefully. Were employees aware Ruth wasn't present? Some were. And Karen sighed. They believed Ethan was assisting an elderly parent. She looked genuinely upset. No one imagined. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. On the drive back, David remained unusually quiet. Finally, I asked, "What are you thinking?" He looked out the windshield. I'm thinking Ethan became increasingly confident. Meaning... He stopped hiding. I frowned. What makes you say that? Because early changes were cautious. He counted them off. Passwords, statements, notifications. Later, he continued, he visited the bank openly, met employees, submitted documentation. Eventually, he looked directly at me. He became bold enough to place forged papers in front of you. Confidence, not desperation. That realization frightened me. People rarely took greater risks unless earlier ones had succeeded, which meant, how many times had Ethan already succeeded without my noticing? Back home, I found another text waiting. Mom just checking whether David has looked at everything yet. This time, David suggested we answer together. He dictated. He's reviewing the documents carefully. He has a few technical questions. I'll let you know when he's finished. I sent it. Less than 30 seconds later, Ethan replied. Sounds good. Happy to answer anything. David smiled. Interesting. What? He wants to stay involved. Michael nodded. He's trying to control the conversation. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Maybe we could all meet together. That might save time. David laughed quietly. There it is. What? The next move. Instead of waiting for me to return the papers, Ethan wanted direct access to my attorney. Why to persuade him to monitor what David knew? Or simply to accelerate the process, David considered the message for several moments. Then he looked at me. I think we accept. I blinked. What? We meet? My heart raced. Isn't that dangerous? Not if we control the setting. Michael smiled. And not if Ethan believes he's walking into an ordinary legal discussion. David picked up his phone. I'll arrange it. Where? My office. When? As soon as possible. He looked at me steadily. Antin, everything has been leading toward this. I suddenly understood. The investigation was changing. Until now, we had quietly gathered evidence. Soon, Ethan would begin revealing himself. As I drove home that evening, memories of my little boy kept returning. The 7-year-old who proudly showed me every report card, the teenager who stayed up late helping Thomas shovel snow, the college graduate who hugged me after receiving his diploma and whispered, I couldn't have done this without you. Where had that boy gone, or had he simply grown into someone I had never truly known? That night I stood in Thomas's study holding one of our old family photo albums. In one picture, Ethan couldn't have been older than 10. He sat between us at a picnic table, smiling with missing front teeth, his arms wrapped tightly around both his parents. I touched the photograph gently. I still don't know when I lost you. The room remained silent, but somehow I felt Thomas's presence beside me, not answering the question, simply reminding me why I couldn't stop now, because this was no longer just about saving my home. It was about uncovering the truth, no matter how painful that truth might become, and somewhere across town, completely unaware of what had already been uncovered. My son was preparing for the meeting he believed would finally convince me to sign away my entire future. David scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday afternoon. He deliberately described it as an informal review, nothing confrontational, nothing unusual, just an opportunity for everyone to clarify a few legal questions before I signed the estate documents. That wording had been his idea. If Ethan believes this is merely another step toward getting your signature, David explained, he'll arrive confident. And confident people tend to reveal more than careful ones. For the next 3 days, my life became strangely ordinary. I watered the flowers in my backyard. I attended Wednesday Bible study at church. I met Emily Parker for coffee. I even graded essays for a volunteer literacy program. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Inside, every hour felt like the slow ticking of a clock counting down to something irreversible. Thursday arrived bright and warm. I dressed carefully, not because appearances mattered to me, because I wanted Ethan to see the same mother he believed he understood. A soft blue blouse, cream-colored slacks, the pearl earrings Thomas had given me on our 30th anniversary. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a retired schoolteacher, not a frightened victim. That gave me strength. David's office looked exactly as it always had, comfortable, professional, safe. The only noticeable difference was that Michael Reynolds had already arrived. He sat quietly near the conference table reviewing several folders. Karen Brooks joined us a few minutes later. She wouldn't participate directly. She would simply observe. David had explained that her presence might become important if banking procedures were discussed. At precisely 2 o'clock, the receptionist knocked softly. "They're here," David looked at me. "Ready?" I nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The door opened. Ethan entered first, confident, smiling. Lauren followed, carrying the familiar navy blue folder. She wore the same pleasant expression she always used at family gatherings. If someone had walked past the conference room, they would have assumed we were preparing for a routine estate planning session. Only 5 people inside knew the truth. After introductions, everyone took their seats. Ethan looked around the room. I didn't realize this many people would be involved. David smiled politely. Complex estate planning sometimes requires additional professionals. That answer seemed to satisfy him, for the moment. Lauren placed the folder in front of David. We really appreciate you reviewing everything. David opened it slowly. I've read every page. Ethan nodded. Great. I imagine you found everything straightforward. David looked up. I found it interesting. A brief silence followed. Then David removed his reading glasses. I have several questions. Ethan leaned back comfortably. Of course. David lifted the first document. Why does this trust remove Ruth as acting trustee immediately rather than upon incapacity or death? Ethan answered without hesitation. That's standard asset protection. David remained expressionless. No, it isn't. The room grew noticeably quieter. Ethan blinked once. I'm not an attorney. David nodded. Neither am I pretending to misunderstand the document. He turned another page. Second question. Why does this power of attorney become effective immediately? Again, Ethan smiled. Administrative convenience. David shook his head gently. Immediate powers of attorney are used in specific circumstances. They are not routine. Lauren joined the conversation. The attorney who prepared these recommended that structure. David looked directly at her. Which attorney? She hesitated for the first time. A specialist. Name. She glanced briefly toward Ethan. I'd have to check. David reached into his file. I already did. He placed a business card on the table. The attorney practices nearly 200 miles away. Another pause. Why? Neither Ethan nor Lauren answered immediately. Finally, Ethan shrugged. He came highly recommended. By whom? A colleague. What colleague? Another hesitation. I don't remember. Michael quietly made a note. The confidence Ethan had carried into the room began fading almost visibly. David continued calmly. Let's discuss the property transfer. He slid the deed across the table. Can you explain why Ruth's residence would become subject to sale authority under trustee discretion? Ethan frowned. That's not what it says. David turned the document toward him. It is precisely what it says. Silence. Lauren leaned forward. I think you're interpreting that too broadly. David smiled politely. I've practiced estate law for 45 years. I assure you. He tapped the paragraph. I'm interpreting it correctly. I watched Ethan carefully. For the first time since entering the room, he looked uncertain, not frightened, just unprepared. He hadn't expected resistance from David. He certainly hadn't expected detailed questions. David continued, Perhaps we should simplify this. He folded his hands. What exactly were you asking your mother to sign? Ethan answered carefully. An updated estate plan. David nodded. What would change the moment she signed? Nothing significant. David immediately turned toward me. Ruth? Yes. If you had signed these documents, he spoke clearly. Would you still control your trust? I already knew the answer. No. David looked back at Ethan. Correct. Another question. Would Ruth retain exclusive authority over her investment accounts? No response. David answered himself. No. Another. Would she maintain sole control over decisions involving her home? Silence again. No. Another. Would Ethan immediately gain expanded legal authority over her finances? Still no answer. Yes. The room felt unbearably still. Finally, Ethan spoke. You're making this sound sinister. David remained calm. I'm making it sound accurate. Lauren crossed her arms. You're assuming the worst. Michael finally spoke for the first time. No. He slid several charts across the table. We're examining patterns. Ethan looked confused. What patterns? Michael calmly displayed the financial timeline. Password changes, notification changes, recovery number updates, investment reallocations, bank visits, communication redirections. Each event appeared in chronological order, connected, organized, documented. I watched Ethan's eyes move across the pages. His face changed, very slightly but enough. He recognized the timeline. David noticed it too. "You've seen these dates before." Ethan looked up quickly. "They're my mother's accounts." "Exactly." David leaned forward. "So perhaps you can explain something." He placed another document beside the timeline. "Why was your phone number listed as the recovery contact instead of Ruth's?" Ethan answered immediately. "She asked me." I spoke quietly. "I didn't." His head turned toward me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he looked back at David. "She must have forgotten." Karen Brooks finally entered the conversation. "Our bank records indicate the change remained active for over a year." She paused. "During that period," she opened another folder. 7 separate verification calls were redirected. Ethan's expression froze. Karen continued. "None reached Ruth. No one spoke." David waited deliberately. Silence has a remarkable way of encouraging people to speak. Eventually, Ethan did. "I was helping her." David nodded. "I believe you were involved." "Helping." The words sounded hollow. Michael quietly placed one final page on the table. Metadata analysis, electronic signature information, device identification, timestamp comparison. David looked directly at Ethan. "One last question." He pushed the report forward. "If Ruth signed these documents..." He paused. Why were several electronic authorizations generated from a device that wasn't hers? For the first time, Ethan had no immediate answer. He looked at Lauren. Lauren looked back at him. Neither spoke. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "There must be some mistake." David folded the report closed. "Perhaps." His voice remained perfectly calm. "That's exactly what we're trying to determine." The meeting wasn't over, not even close, but as I looked across the table at my son, I realized something profound. The confident financial advisor who had walked into David's office believing he controlled every conversation had quietly disappeared. In his place sat a man who suddenly understood. His mother had asked far more questions than he'd ever expected, and somewhere behind the uncertainty now visible in his eyes, the first cracks in his carefully built plan had finally begun to show. The silence in David's conference room stretched longer than anyone seemed willing to break. Ethan stared at the metadata report in front of him. Lauren kept her eyes fixed on the table. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, neither of them appeared to have a prepared answer. David finally closed the folder in front of him. "I think we've reached the point where honesty would be more productive than explanations." Ethan slowly exhaled. "You're treating me like a criminal." "No," David replied evenly. "We're treating these documents as evidence that requires an explanation. There's a difference." Ethan leaned back in his chair and forced a laugh. "This is unbelievable. I've spent years helping my mother. I organize her finances. I protect her investments. And suddenly, everyone assumes I'm trying to steal from her." Michael remained calm. "No one is assuming anything." He tapped the financial timeline. "We're following documented facts. The facts need context. Then give us that context." Again. Silence. I watched my son's face carefully. He looked nothing like the frightened little boy who used to confess whenever he broke something around the house. This wasn't guilt. It was calculation. He was deciding which version of the truth would serve him best. Lauren spoke first. "I think this entire situation is based on misunderstanding." David nodded politely. "Please explain." She straightened in her chair. "Ruth has been overwhelmed since Thomas passed away. I've seen how stressful paperwork has become for her. We were simply trying to make sure everything would be organized before there was an emergency." Her voice was calm, measured, convincing. Had I heard those same words 2 weeks earlier, I might have believed every one of them. But now I recognized something my years as a teacher had taught me long ago. She answered a question no one had asked. David noticed it too. No one disputes the value of organization. He folded his hands. Our concern is authority. Specifically, he looked directly at Ethan. Why did Ruth need to lose control of her assets immediately? Lauren opened her mouth. David gently interrupted. I asked Ethan. For several seconds, my son simply looked at me. Then he spoke quietly. Because I was worried. Worried about what? I asked. You've been forgetting things. The words hit me harder than I expected. Forgetting, he nodded. You've repeated stories. You've misplaced bills. You've asked me the same financial questions more than once, Lauren added softly. We've both noticed it. I felt my stomach sink. This was their strategy. David turned toward me. Ruth, have you ever been diagnosed with any cognitive condition? No. Karen spoke next. Has any physician recommended financial supervision? No. Michael asked another question. Have you ever missed pension payments, mortgage obligations, or taxes because of memory problems? Never. David looked back at Ethan. So what objective evidence supports your concern? Ethan hesitated. He searched for words. I just noticed changes. David nodded slowly. Normal aging isn't legal incapacity. No one suggested legal incapacity. David lifted the medical authorization. This document does. The room became quiet again. I suddenly remembered another conversation from almost a year earlier. Ethan. He looked toward me. Do you remember asking me whether I'd ever considered seeing a neurologist? His eyes widened slightly. It was only a suggestion. You said everyone should get checked after 65. Lauren answered instead. Preventive medicine is important. I ignored her. And do you remember asking me whether I'd ever gotten confused while driving? Ethan looked uncomfortable. You misunderstood. No. I spoke more firmly than I had intended. I remember because the question surprised me. He looked away. Another memory surfaced. The afternoon he'd insisted on installing a medication organizer because, according to him, older people often forget doses. At the time, I'd appreciated the thoughtfulness. Now, I wondered whether he had been quietly building a narrative, one that portrayed me as less capable than I truly was. David seemed to reach the same conclusion. He opened another folder. Over the past 18 months, he looked directly at Ethan. Have you discussed your mother's memory with any financial institution? No. Karen slid one document across the table. Then perhaps you can explain this notation. Ethan picked it up. His expression changed almost instantly. The note read, Customer's son reports increasing difficulty managing financial decisions independently. He looked up quickly. I didn't write that. No, Karen agreed. But an employee documented the conversation. I never said that. Karen remained composed. Our investigator interviewed the employee yesterday. Another long pause. She remembers the discussion clearly. I felt a chill run through me. Had Ethan really been telling people I couldn't manage my own affairs without ever speaking to me, without any medical diagnosis, without any evidence? I looked at my son. When? He didn't answer. When did you decide I wasn't capable anymore? He rubbed his forehead. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. I was trying to protect you. From whom? No response. From me. Still nothing. My voice softened. Ethan, I buried your father. I rebuilt my life. I've managed this home. I've paid every bill. I've never asked you for money. So tell me. I felt tears gathering despite my efforts. What exactly were you protecting me from? For the first time, my son couldn't look me in the eyes. Lauren suddenly leaned forward. This isn't fair. David raised an eyebrow. What isn't fair? You're all attacking Ethan. Michael calmly replied, We're asking questions. Questions supported by documents. Lauren crossed her arms. You've already decided he's guilty. David shook his head. If that were true, he closed every folder on the table. This meeting wouldn't be happening. We're giving him every opportunity to explain. He turned back toward Ethan. Take all the time you need. No interruptions. No accusations. Simply explain. The room fell silent once more. Nearly a full minute passed. Finally, Ethan spoke. I was under pressure, that was new. What kind of pressure? David asked. My business. He looked exhausted for the first time. The market changed. I lost several important clients. My income wasn't stable anymore. Lauren stared at him in surprise. Apparently, she hadn't expected him to say that. I didn't want Mom worrying. I listened quietly. So instead, I asked, you decided to take over my finances. No. He shook his head quickly. I just thought, his voice faded. I thought it would be easier if everything was already organized. David didn't interrupt. Neither did anyone else. Eventually, Ethan added, I never planned to hurt you. Those words hung in the air. I wanted desperately to believe them. Part of me still did, but intentions alone couldn't erase forged signatures, or redirected bank calls, or documents that transferred my home. I stood slowly. Everyone looked at me. I walked to the conference room window. Outside, people crossed the street carrying coffee cups, talking on their phones, laughing with coworkers. Ordinary lives, ordinary families. I wondered how many of them realized how fragile trust could be. Without turning around, I spoke quietly. When you were 8 years old, I said, you took $20 from your father's wallet. No one moved. You cried harder than I did when you admitted it. You told us you were afraid we'd stop loving you. I finally turned back toward Ethan. Do you remember what your father said? His eyes filled with tears. Very slowly, he nodded. Money can always be earned again. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Character is much harder to rebuild. I nodded. Exactly. The room fell silent once more, because every person there understood the same thing. This meeting was no longer about legal documents. It was about something far more difficult. Whether the man sitting across from me still had enough character left to tell the whole truth. No one spoke after I reminded Ethan of what his father had said. The silence didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. It felt inevitable. For the first time since we had all gathered in David's conference room, there was nothing left to hide behind. No legal terminology, no vague explanations, no carefully rehearsed reassurances, only the truth. Ethan lowered his head and rested both hands on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. I never thought it would go this far. David didn't interrupt. Neither did anyone else. It started after my biggest client left. He swallowed hard. They represented almost 40% of my annual income. I told myself I'd replace them in a few months. I didn't. Michael quietly took notes. Ethan continued. Then the market dropped. A few investments performed badly. My commissions kept shrinking. He rubbed his forehead. I didn't tell Mom. I didn't tell anyone. Lauren looked down. I couldn't tell whether she already knew this part of the story or whether she was hearing it for the first time. I was embarrassed. I've spent my whole career telling people how to protect their financial futures. And suddenly, he gave a bitter laugh. I couldn't protect my own. I listened without saying a word. I started borrowing, first from savings, then from a line of credit. Then, he stopped. David asked calmly, then what? I convinced myself everything would recover. It always does. I just needed time. Michael looked up. So you created a plan. Ethan nodded slowly. I told myself Mom wouldn't actually lose anything. He looked toward me. I honestly believed I'd fix everything before she ever noticed. Those words broke my heart more than any legal document ever could, because they revealed something I hadn't wanted to admit. My son hadn't acted in one moment of madness. He had made hundreds of deliberate choices, each one justified by the belief that he could repair the damage later. I had seen that thinking before, not in financial criminals, in children. One lie to avoid punishment, then another to protect the first. Eventually, the lies became larger than the original mistake. David leaned forward. When did forgery enter the picture? Ethan closed his eyes. I never planned that. Answer the question. His shoulders sagged. When Mom hesitated signing earlier insurance documents, I frowned. Earlier documents. He nodded without looking at me. There were a few forms. What forms? Beneficiary updates. Communication authorizations. My heart sank. So David was right. There were earlier documents. He nodded once. I copied your signature. The words landed with frightening simplicity. No denial, no excuse, just the truth. I felt as though the air had disappeared from the room. Karen quietly closed her notebook. Michael stopped writing. Even David remained silent. Finally, I asked, how many times? Ethan hesitated. I don't remember. No. My voice remained calm. You do. His eyes filled with tears. 6. 6 separate occasions. Not one desperate mistake. Not one impulsive decision. 6 calculated choices. And the bank verification calls, I asked. I answered them. You pretended to be me. He nodded. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The betrayal felt larger now, not because of money, because every action required him to imagine my voice, to answer questions as though he were me, to erase me while pretending to protect me. David finally spoke. The estate documents? Were they your idea? Ethan looked toward Lauren. She remained perfectly still. After several long seconds, he answered, No. Another silence. David asked carefully, Whose idea? Ethan whispered, Mine. Lauren turned toward him sharply. Ethan? He interrupted her. No. His voice cracked. I'm done. He looked directly at me. I asked an attorney outside Columbus because I didn't want anyone who knew Dad. I knew David would never approve those documents. I wasn't surprised anymore, just tired. So you planned around the people who loved us? He nodded. I told myself. He stopped again. What? I asked quietly. I told myself the house would eventually belong to me anyway. There it was. The sentence neither of us had wanted to hear. Inheritance, not love, not protection, expectation, but eventually wasn't soon enough. Tears rolled down his face. No. I looked at the son I had raised, the little boy who used to run into my classroom after school carrying drawings he'd made, the teenager who promised he'd always take care of me, the young man who had stood beside Thomas's hospital bed and sworn, I'll look after Mom. I believed every word. Perhaps he had believed them too, at the time. What about the house? I asked. Were you really planning to sell it? He nodded. The market is high. I thought... Another painful pause. I thought we could invest the money. And where would I live? He couldn't answer. I repeated the question. Where would I live, Ethan? His silence answered for him. Lauren finally spoke. We were going to help you find a beautiful retirement community. I looked directly at her. Without asking me, she lowered her eyes. No response. David carefully organized the documents into neat stacks. Ruth, I turned toward him. The legal situation can be addressed. The forged documents, the banking issues, the fraudulent authorizations. We can deal with all of that. He paused. But one decision belongs only to you. I knew what he meant. Whether to pursue criminal charges. The room became impossibly quiet. Everyone waited. Even Ethan. I looked at my son for a very long time. Then I asked the only question still left in my heart. When you hugged me last Sunday, he looked up, and told me you loved me. My voice trembled despite every effort to control it. Was that true? His answer came immediately. Yes. No hesitation, no calculation, just one word. Yes. I believed him. Strangely, that made everything hurt even more, because love had existed. It simply hadn't been strong enough to overcome greed. I stood and picked up my purse. I need some air. No one tried to stop me. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk. People walked past without recognizing the quiet tragedy unfolding inside the law office behind me. I stood alone for several minutes, remembering something Thomas once told me after disciplining Ethan as a child. Real consequences aren't revenge. They're opportunities. Without consequences, people rarely become better. As I looked through the office window at my son sitting alone with his head buried in his hands, I realized Thomas had been right again. Forgiveness and accountability were not enemies. Sometimes, they were the only path toward redemption. The question was no longer whether Ethan had betrayed me. He had. The question now was whether I loved him enough to make him face the consequences of what he had done. I didn't go back into David's office for nearly 20 minutes. Instead, I walked slowly around the block, letting the warm afternoon air steady my breathing. People smiled as they passed me. A young father held his daughter's hand while she skipped along the sidewalk. An elderly couple shared an ice cream cone on a nearby bench. Life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet my world had changed forever. I had come to David's office hoping to discover the truth. Now that I finally had it, I realized something painful. The truth doesn't automatically tell you what to do next. By the time I returned, the conference room had emptied. Only David remained. He was quietly organizing files into separate folders. He looked up as I entered. "How are you holding up?" I gave a tired smile. "I honestly don't know," he nodded. "That's a perfectly reasonable answer." I sat across from him. "Where's Ethan?" "He and Lauren left about 10 minutes ago." I looked down at the polished wooden table. I couldn't even say goodbye. David waited patiently. I kept seeing him at 8 years old. The little boy who cried because he stole $20 from Thomas. He smiled gently. "You still see your son." "I do. And that's what makes this so difficult." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, David slid 3 folders toward me. "These represent 3 different paths." I looked at them. The first was labeled civil recovery, the second criminal referral, the third protective actions. David opened the last folder first. "No matter what else you decide," he looked directly at me, "these happen immediately." He began making a list. Every account password changes. Every financial authorization is revoked. Every power of attorney is formally rejected. We notify every financial institution. We record affidavits confirming the forged documents. We place alerts on your property. I nodded after each point. For the first time in weeks, I felt as though I was taking my life back instead of watching it slip away. "What about the house?" David smiled. "No one is selling your house. Not now. Not ever. Unless I chose to." Those words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The second folder, civil recovery. If any money can be traced to unauthorized transfers, we pursue repayment. And the third, David became quiet. Criminal charges. The words lingered between us. "I don't have to decide today." "No. In fact," he closed the folder, "I'd prefer you didn't. You've had enough life-changing decisions for 1 week." I let out a slow breath. "Thank you." He smiled. "Thomas would have told you the same thing." That evening, I drove home through streets that suddenly looked different. Not because Columbus had changed, because I had. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes before getting out. The late afternoon sunlight covered the front porch in gold. Thomas had built that porch swing himself. Every board, every bolt, every coat of paint. I walked over and sat down. The swing creaked softly beneath me. For years, I had thought this house represented security. Now I understood it represented something much greater. It represented choices, sacrifice. 43 years of shared dreams. No document could erase that. The following morning, Emily came over carrying 2 cups of coffee. She took one look at my face. "He admitted it." I nodded. "He admitted everything." She sat beside me on the porch swing. "I'm so sorry. I think—" I paused. "I'm grieving someone who's still alive." Emily reached for my hand. "I've heard parents describe addiction that way, or estrangement. They say it's a different kind of loss." I stared across the yard. "I keep wondering whether I failed him." She answered immediately. No, I must have. No, Ruth. She squeezed my hand. You taught thousands of children. Some became doctors. Some became mechanics. Some became wonderful parents. You gave all of them the same kindness. Each still made their own choices. I knew she was right. Teachers influence, parents guide. Neither controls another human being forever. That afternoon, I received a letter from Michael. Inside was a summary of his completed forensic review. The conclusion was clear. No evidence suggested my retirement savings had been completely drained. Most assets remained intact because the final transfer documents had never been signed. Ironically, the moment I turned to the last page first had saved almost everything Thomas and I had spent a lifetime building. One instinct, one decision, one extra minute of reading. That was all that stood between security and disaster. I placed the report inside Thomas's study. Then I opened another drawer. Inside lay our original wills, yellowed slightly with age. Thomas's handwriting appeared in the margins beside several legal paragraphs. One note caught my attention. If anything ever feels rushed, stop. I smiled through tears. He had written those words years before smartphones, electronic signatures, and online banking. Yet somehow, they had become the advice that saved me. 3 days later, Ethan called. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Hello, Ethan. He struggled to find words. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I am listening. Another long silence. I've resigned. From work, I closed my eyes. I told my partners everything. They asked for my resignation. I'm cooperating. Part of me hurt for him. Another part quietly recognized that accountability had begun. I've also started meeting with a counselor, he continued. I don't expect forgiveness. His voice broke. I wanted you to know I'm finally telling the truth. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around my living room, at Thomas's favorite chair, our wedding photograph, the bookshelf we had assembled together one Saturday afternoon decades earlier. I hope you keep telling the truth, I finally said, even when it's difficult. I will. I promise. Promises. Once they had been enough. Now I understood something different. Real change wasn't measured by promises. It was measured by consistent actions over time. Before ending the call, Ethan quietly asked, "Will you ever be able to trust me again?" The question lingered in my heart. I don't know, I answered honestly. But trust isn't rebuilt with words. It begins with accepting the consequences of your choices. He whispered, I understand. After we hung up, I stood by the living room window watching autumn leaves drift across the yard. For the first time since Thomas died, I no longer felt helpless. My finances were protected. My home was safe. Most importantly, my voice belonged to me again. The woman who had almost signed away her future without reading the final page was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who finally understood that love should never require surrendering independence. And as difficult as the journey had been, I knew one chapter of my life had ended. Another was finally beginning. 6 months passed more quietly than I ever imagined possible. For the first few weeks after Ethan's confession, I expected my phone to ring constantly. I expected reporters, lawyers, neighbors asking uncomfortable questions. None of that happened. Life didn't explode. It simply rearranged itself. David helped me complete every protective measure we had discussed. Every financial account required new passwords known only to me. All previous authorizations were formally revoked. My bank placed enhanced identity verification on every account. Any future changes would require my physical presence and multiple forms of identification. Karen personally called to confirm each safeguard had been activated. I hope we never have to speak under these circumstances again, she said warmly. I hope so too, I replied. For the first time in months, I slept through an entire night without waking at 3 a.m, wondering whether another document had been signed without my knowledge. The house felt peaceful again, not because painful memories had disappeared, because uncertainty had. One Saturday morning, I walked through every room carrying a small notebook. Instead of looking for evidence, I wrote down memories. The dining room. Thomas taught Ethan how to carve Thanksgiving turkey here. The living room. Our first Christmas tree after moving into the house barely fit the ceiling. The hallway. Pencil marks recording Ethan's height every birthday. The kitchen. Thomas danced with me while homemade bread baked in the oven. I wasn't documenting property anymore. I was documenting a life. That distinction mattered. A house could be appraised. A home could not. A few weeks later, Emily convinced me to join a volunteer reading program at the Columbus Community Learning Center. I know what you're going to say. She laughed when she called. I'm too old. You are. I am. Too old to spend every afternoon sitting alone thinking about what happened. She had a point. The center paired retired teachers with adults learning to read later in life. Many were immigrants. Some had grown up in difficult circumstances. Others simply never had the educational opportunities most people took for granted. During my first session, a 53-year-old grandfather named Harold struggled through a children's storybook. Every time he correctly sounded out a difficult word, his face lit up exactly the way my third graders' faces had decades earlier. I realized something wonderful. Purpose doesn't retire. It simply changes classrooms. Gradually, my calendar became full again. Monday mornings at the Learning Center, Wednesday lunches with Emily, Thursday gardening club, Friday evenings volunteering at church. Life slowly expanded beyond grief, beyond betrayal, beyond court documents and investigations. One afternoon, David invited me to speak at a community seminar about financial protection for older adults. My first instinct was to refuse. I'm not a public speaker. He laughed. You spent 38 years speaking to classrooms. That's different. Not really. The seminar attracted nearly 80 retirees. Some came alone. Others arrived with adult children. As I stood at the podium, I looked around the room and saw dozens of faces that reminded me of my own. People who had spent their lives trusting family. People who believed love automatically guaranteed honesty. I began quietly. My name is Ruth Cole. I almost signed away everything my husband and I spent 43 years building. The room became perfectly still. I didn't tell them every painful detail. I didn't need to. Instead, I shared the lessons Thomas had taught me. Read every page, ask every question. Never apologize for protecting your independence. Trust people. But never stop verifying important decisions. When I finished speaking, the audience applauded politely. Then something unexpected happened. People lined up to talk with me. One woman admitted she'd been signing documents without reading them because her grandson always said he was too busy to explain. Another gentleman confessed he'd given online banking access to a nephew he'd barely questioned. Several simply wanted a hug. I realized my story no longer belonged only to me. If sharing it prevented one other family from experiencing the same heartbreak, then perhaps something good had finally emerged from all the pain. Later that evening, David smiled. You've probably helped more people today than you realize. I thought about that during the drive home. Perhaps healing wasn't forgetting. Perhaps healing meant transforming suffering into something useful. Ethan remained absent from my daily life. We exchanged occasional messages, birthdays, Christmas, Mother's Day. Nothing more. He honored every legal agreement. He cooperated fully with civil restitution. He continued counseling. David kept me informed without sharing unnecessary details. One afternoon, however, I received an unexpected letter, handwritten, not typed. The envelope carried Ethan's familiar handwriting. Inside was only one page. No excuses, no requests, no demands, just honesty. Mom. I've rewritten this letter at least 20 times. Every version sounded like I was asking you to make me feel better. I don't deserve that. Counseling has forced me to admit something I never wanted to face. I didn't become dishonest overnight. I spent years convincing myself small compromises didn't matter. Eventually, I couldn't even recognize how far I drifted from the values you and Dad gave me. I understand now that forgiveness isn't something I can ask for. It's something I have to become worthy of, even if it never comes. I hope someday you'll see a man who finally learned the lessons his parents tried to teach him. Love always, Ethan. I read the letter 3 times, then I placed it inside Thomas's study. Not with legal documents, with family photographs, because regardless of everything that had happened, he was still my son. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emily joined me on the porch swing. We watched children ride bicycles through the neighborhood. "You look different," she said. "I do. You've stopped waiting." I thought about that. She was right. For months I'd been waiting for investigations, waiting for answers, waiting for apologies, waiting for life to begin again. Somewhere along the way, it already had. I smiled. "I think Thomas would approve," Emily laughed. "I think he'd tell you to repaint the porch." I looked around. The white trim had indeed begun peeling, for the first time in a very long while. The future felt wonderfully ordinary. A porch to repaint, flowers to plant, students waiting to read with me Monday morning, friends expecting me for lunch. Life wasn't asking me to survive anymore. It was inviting me to live, and after everything that had happened, I was finally ready to accept the invitation. A full year has passed since the evening my son placed a folder in front of me and casually said, "Sign here before dinner." Sometimes I still think about that moment, not with anger, not even with sadness, mostly with gratitude, because one small decision changed everything. If I had signed those papers without reading them, I would have lost far more than my home. I would have lost my independence, my confidence, perhaps even my belief that my own judgment still mattered. Instead, I turned to the last page first. People often ask me why. I wish I had a dramatic answer. I don't. There wasn't a voice from heaven. There wasn't a sudden feeling of danger. There was only a quiet impulse, one that I almost ignored. Life is strange that way. Sometimes the smallest pause protects us from the biggest mistakes. Today my mornings look very different than they did a year ago. I wake up early, make a cup of coffee, and sit on the back porch where Thomas and I used to watch the sunrise together. The old maple tree still shades the yard. The birds still gather near the feeder every morning. The porch swing still creaks exactly the way it always has. Some things never needed changing. After breakfast, I usually spend a few hours volunteering at the Community Learning Center. Harold, the gentleman who struggled through children's books during our first lesson together, recently finished reading his very first novel. The day he completed the final chapter, he looked at me with tears in his eyes. I never thought I'd live long enough to do this. I smiled because I understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes victory arrives much later than we expect. That doesn't make it any less meaningful. The seminars David encouraged me to teach have also continued to grow. What began as one community presentation has become a monthly workshop attended by retirees, caregivers, adult children, and even young couples beginning to plan their futures. I always begin with the same sentence: "Trust is beautiful." Then I pause. But trust should never replace understanding. People often nod before I explain why. Many tell me afterward that they feel guilty asking family members difficult financial questions. I understand that feeling. I lived with it myself. Somehow we convince ourselves that asking questions means we don't love the people closest to us. The truth is exactly the opposite. Healthy relationships survive honest questions. Only unhealthy ones depend on blind obedience. David still laughs whenever I quote Thomas during those workshops. Always read every page. That simple sentence has become almost a motto, not because it only applies to legal documents, because it applies to life. Read carefully, listen carefully, think carefully. Never allow urgency to replace wisdom. As for Ethan, our relationship remains complicated. Healing isn't a straight line. There are good days. There are difficult days. We meet occasionally for lunch, never to discuss legal matters, never to reopen old wounds, simply to learn who we are now. The first lunch was awkward. Neither of us knew where to begin. Finally, Ethan looked across the table and said something I never expected. "Why, Ingmai? I don't want you to forgive the man I became. I want to become someone worthy of being your son again." There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tears in the middle of the restaurant, no miraculous moment where everything returned to normal. Real life rarely works that way. Trust grows slowly, especially after it has been broken. Over the past year, Ethan has kept every promise he made after his confession. He accepted responsibility for the financial consequences. He rebuilt his career from the ground up, this time working in a role that no longer gives him direct authority over clients' assets. He continued counseling. He volunteered with a nonprofit organization that teaches financial ethics to young professionals entering the industry. None of those things erased what happened, but they demonstrated something important. People cannot change the past. They can only change the direction of their future. Lauren and I have spoken only a handful of times. Our conversations remain polite but distant. She eventually admitted that she had ignored warning signs because she wanted to believe Ethan's explanations. Whether that was fear, denial, or ambition, only she truly knows. I no longer spend my energy trying to answer questions that belong to someone else's conscience. Peace requires accepting that not every mystery will be solved. One of the greatest gifts this experience gave me was something completely unexpected. It returned my confidence. For months after Thomas died, I quietly convinced myself that I needed someone else to handle complicated decisions. Not because anyone forced me, because grief made me doubt myself. Now I manage my own finances again. I ask questions without embarrassment. I meet with professionals before making important decisions. I understand my investments. I read every statement. Most importantly, I trust my own judgment. That confidence has spread into every part of my life. And last spring, I finally repainted the porch Emily kept teasing me about. This summer, I planted roses where Thomas always wanted a flower garden. Next month, Emily and I are taking our first vacation together, a short trip through New England to admire the autumn leaves. For years, I believed the happiest chapters of my life had already been written. I was wrong. New chapters don't belong only to young people. They belong to anyone willing to keep turning the page. Sometimes I walk into Thomas's study and open the drawer where his handwritten note still rests beside our old estate documents. If anything ever feels rushed, stop. I smile every time I read it, not because it reminds me of betrayal, because it reminds me of wisdom. Thomas isn't here to protect me anymore, but the lessons we built together still are. And perhaps that's what love truly leaves behind. Not money, not houses, not possessions, but principles strong enough to guide the people we leave behind. If someone had asked me a year ago what my greatest fear was, I would have answered without hesitation. Losing everything. Now I know better. The greatest loss isn't money, it's surrendering your voice. The day I chose to read instead of simply signing, I reclaimed that voice. And no document in the world will ever take it away again. If this journey taught me anything, it's that love and wisdom must always walk together. We should absolutely trust the people we love, but trust should never require us to stop thinking. Stop asking questions or stop protecting the life we've worked so hard to build. Reading carefully, seeking advice, and understanding what you sign are not signs of suspicion. They are acts of responsibility. Family relationships are precious, but true love respects honesty, transparency, and healthy boundaries. When those boundaries disappear, even the strongest families can be placed at risk. At the same time, accountability and forgiveness are not opposites. Holding someone responsible for their choices can become the very thing that gives them the opportunity to change. If my story encourages even one person to slow down, read one more page, ask one more question, or seek one trusted professional opinion before signing an important document, then every painful step of this journey will have had a purpose. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. Your stories may help someone else find the courage to protect both their future and the people they care about.